So what I've got here is just an image of myself. So I'm going to go through the Edge Refine feature, which hopefully, once I've done just a basic selection, will get rid of parts of the background and general unwanted elements, so I can just have a nice cutout of my head and shoulders. So I've done a really rough job. You can see there where I've missed some sections of the hair, and some bits have got parts of the background in it, etc. So what we're going to do now is just go into the Refine Edge section. So what we're going to do is we're just going to expand the radius here. Now as you can see, that's already just smoothed off a couple of the edges. It's made a far better job of cutting out the shoulder, for example, there. So I'm just going to refine it a little bit further by just doing a bit of edge smoothing. And adding a little bit of a feather as well. So as you can see already, we've started to get rid of just a little bit of background around there. The edges, there is a little bit of a halo, but it's generally looking much better, much smoother. Now one other tool that we can employ is, first of all, we can switch the view. So we've got black and white, and then use the brush tool. And what this will do is, if I start painting around the edge, like so, this will detect any sections of within that, for example hair or parts of clothing, that may well want to be included in the image. So as you can see, this is a far simpler way of executing the cutouts that you'd normally do using masks. And if you've got, say for example, a quick portrait that you need to execute, then this could potentially save you a lot of time. Now, one of the other elements within Photoshop CS5 that's been getting a lot of attention is the Content Aware Fill. Now what this does is something very similar to the cloning tool, in that it finds a selection and replaces whatever that subject might be with elements from around it from the background. Now the first facet to that is the healing tool, which I've got selected here. Now as you can see in this image, I've got a pretty decent image of a rally car here, a nice bit of motion in it, but unfortunately there's all of this sort of yellowy crabgrass right in the foreground here, which is a little bit distracting, so I wouldn't mind getting rid of that. So what I've got here is the, as I've said before, the healing tool just selected, and content aware. I've also got my brush size reasonably large. Now it's best not to go in too ham-fisted with this and try and select it all with a massive brush size, because what we found is that it tends to just grab content from across the image, and I'd probably get, say, a car wheel or a bush or something along those lines in there. Now what I'm just doing here, as you can see, is I'm just kind of roughly going around it. I don't have to be completely exact with my selection, but I'm at least getting as close to the edges as I can. But what we'll do is we'll just do quite a rough selection here. Now if I just release the cursor, it does take a couple of seconds, obviously depending on the computer that you're running it on and the size of the selection. Now there is, of course, once this is completed, there is of course another facet of the content aware section, which is content aware fill. Now as you can see there, it's not done a terrible job across the grass here. It's obviously, there's a fair amount of smoothing going on there, which you can see. Because I've gone right to the edge of the frame there, it has darkened it slightly, just at the base there. Now what this has here is a couple of signs. Say for example I wanted to get rid of one of these signs, just get rid of this one here, so I'll just do a little box selection, hit the delete key, and what I've got now is the fill box. Now as you can see, there isn't a huge amount of options here. You've got content aware, you've got how you would like it blended, and the opacity of that blend. So if I hit OK, it's gone. Just to go back and forth between them, as you can see, that's done a pretty bang up job. If I just take the selection away, now that part of the image there, you would not be able to tell that it's been removed. What we're going to be looking at in this section is the HDR Merge Pro feature, and what this does is creates HDR images and gives you a lot of options as far as things like ghosting and saturation are concerned. Now the first thing to flag up is the mini bridge. Now what this is a smaller version of Photoshop Bridge, which is your browsing tool within Photoshop. Now what this does is it just gives you a nice simple small preview of your images without having to open up the full Bridge program, which can of course take a little bit of time, especially if your computer's a bit slower. Also within Mini Bridge you can execute a number of little tools such as HDR Pro. So we've got our 3 images highlighted down there at the bottom, as you can see, and what we're going to do is we're just going to click on Merge to HDR Pro, and that's going to grab those 3 images, take the highlights, take the lowlights, the amount of detail within that image, and just combine it into one final shot. Now of course there's been a number of issues with HDR just recently. Things like extreme high amounts of detail, haloing, are all telltale signs of HDR images, can often ruin that natural look. So what we've got there is the final combination of lowlights, highlights, and as you can see it's done a pretty decent job of it. Now what we've got here is removal of ghosts. So say for example something goes across the image, goes across one image but not the other 2, then you can just click on the remove ghosts and that will get rid of any of that. We're quite fortunate within this image that it didn't actually have any, but there was a little bit of motion blur where the tripod wasn't quite steady, and as you can see what it's done there is it's just firmed that up, added a bit of detail, so we've got a far more in focus image here. Now the rest of these options really are, you can get creative with. So for example you can knock the shadowing down, boost the highlights, and as you can see now we've lost quite a lot of detail in the cloud there, so we're just going to take that back to 0. You can also really boost the detail. So like I said before, it can be a bit of a telltale sign of HDR if you've got unnatural looking levels of detail, but with a wide image such as this you can bump it up a bit, just make the image pop a bit more. Now there's also options to, say for example, drop the saturation right down, and as you can see what we've got now is a bit of a black and white image. Now what you can then do is pop back up to your detail settings and just boost that up a bit more. You can also do some alterations with your shadows and your highlights, just because there's that much less contrast within the black and white image. Now if we just take that back up again, similarly you can really boost your vibrancy. Now once again that's another one of those telltale HDR images, but if you are looking for a slightly more creative tint on your HDR images, that's a pretty decent way of doing it. Now what we're going to do now is just leave our HDR image. So what we're going to do now is just do a single image HDR, which we're going to use the HDR toning tool. If we just click on this, now as you can see it's already lightened the sky, lightened the foreground a little bit, and we've got the same options as we do within HDR Pro. Now what we've got for this section is a little bit of a fun feature that Adobe have included just as an extra warp setting, and it's called Puppet Warp. Now the next step is just to go to Edit and to select Puppet Warp. Now what that does is that puts a wire mesh across the object, so what I can do now is add a pointer on his elbow and on his shoulder, and if I just select my elbow joint I can now move his arm around. You can also warp, stretch, etc. But in general this is a good fun feature, and as you can see very easy to execute.